All right, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Students, welcome to another episode of meetings with people who have done great in their line of work. I'll just give you a little brief on my experience with the person who I'm speaking with today. I am a Pakistani, and I've always believed in the Pakistan ideology and the two nations principle, as I call it. And unfortunately, I was never able to find a course that was contemporary and which was linked to this way of thinking and this principle of two nations. Until I discovered a course on Coursera, which was taught by a great professor, Dr. Ebrahim Afsa. It was a long course, I must say. I think it was 8 weeks, and I did it in 2015. It's a course that had enormous impact on me. It was very well delivered, very well taught. It's a course that I recommend for all of my students. Please go on Coursera and try to do the course if you can. And my good luck, I have my teacher, if I may call him, my teacher, Dr. Ebrahim Afsa, with me right now to discuss law, international relations, current affairs, teaching. I mean, he is constrained by time, but when I speak to a person of learning, I can spend hours talking to a person who is an intellectual. And that is the first thing that we are going to discuss today, an intellectual. But before we delve into those areas, little bit about, I think I'll give you 3 minutes, sir, to talk about the University of Copenhagen, its law program, and what undergraduate students need to do to get into that law program, and cost and scholarship, anything you want to tell us about the law program at Copenhagen. Over to you, sir.
Mr. Zaidi, thank you very much for having me. About Copenhagen, it's a very normal Western European tax-funded mass university. So our programs are generally aimed at Danish students, particularly at the bachelor level. Most of the courses will be in Danish and therefore are inaccessible to outsiders. We do, however, have a very active international program at the master's level, where we welcome a fair amount of international students, mostly European, but also quite a few from the wider world. So for your audience, I guess the master program would be more appropriate. And we are particularly strong in courses on international law and constitutional law. These are the fields that I cover. Most of it will be for a European audience, so I'm not sure to what extent it might be relevant to your students, but it is a very good research environment. We don't really have scholarships at the master level, very many, not from the university, but the doctoral level is actually exclusively scholarship paid. So everyone who's admitted to our doctoral program will thereby also get hired by the faculty and receive a very generous living salary, which is enough to live here in Denmark. So at the doctoral level, we are particularly competitively interesting, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that insight. Personally, my daughter wants to do law. She's very interested in law, so I will advise her to go for her master's or PhD program to your university. But now let's start with a few questions about. My first question is, there is a question every good intellectual must ask himself. What is my mission? What is my purpose? What am I pursuing? How should an intellectual or a person who is interested in learning answer this question for himself?
You know, the obvious answer is you need to start reading. I don't think you can become an intellectual without reading a lot. And frankly, it's in the part of the world that we both cover. Reading, unfortunately, is less cherished as it used to be. It's a particular problem in the Arab world, less so in Pakistan and in Iran, where I come from, but particularly in the Arab world, it's a very real problem. It is also acknowledged by the governments. So reading and creating a culture of reading, and particularly of reading material you might not like, is, I think, the absolute indispensable foundation to become a fully versant person. Whether you call that an intellectual or not doesn't matter, but basically someone who is actively engaging with the world requires reading. The second quality is equally indispensable, and that is to keep an open mind, to keep an inquisitive mind. And therefore, again, that requires that you engage with ideas that you might find repulsive, uncomfortable, disagreeable. These are absolutely prerequisites. The third and final quality is that you engage in a genuinely fair engagement with the ideas you encounter. That is, that you don't, and this is something that is a general problem, not just in our part of the world, but generally, is that we live in an age of polarization, and where people take an immediately political, confrontative attitude towards ideas. And I think in order to become an intellectual, as you so poetically put it, requires that you fairly engage with other people's ideas. And that requires, as one of my teachers put it, that you walk in someone else's shoes, that you assume a position that it's not your own, but you put it into your head and you live it and you see the world as someone else sees it. Fairly, accurately, and only then afterwards, once you have engaged fairly with these ideas, then can you proceed to a political or a critical engagement. But the critical engagement should not come first. And that's unfortunately something I see in the world around me very much. Go on.
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head. Understanding is looking at reality from somebody else's perspective. And unless and until we learn to do that, we will not become intelligent people, discerning people. Unfortunately, we live in a world of such extremes that if you are not driven mad by it, then you are not sane, sometimes one feels. But nonetheless, we will now go to our second question, which is related to in a world where people, and there's one more thing that you pointed out, reading. It's very important that you spoke about reading. In our culture, the problem is that we just don't acknowledge that we are not reading enough. The same problem applies in Pakistan. Students are not reading. People wake up in the morning and look at their mobile phones, and the average reading time of a student in our country has fallen to 5 seconds. That is unbelievable. I mean, how can you make an intelligent choice without reading about something in depth, and read something which is difficult? That is something that I point out to my students, and the classic example that I give them is that of the first chapter of Bleak House, the book written by Charles Dickens. Many people just don't read Bleak House because they look at the first chapter, and it's a lovely writing if people read it. But let's now hop to the second question. A young adult comes to me and says, how will I benefit from studying history or international relations in a world dominated by artificial intelligence and computer science? How do I deal with that question?
You know, I am not a Luddite. I love technology. I engage with it. I take it seriously. And I also see the opportunities that it brings. So what I'm going to say is not at all a dismissal of either artificial intelligence or any other modern technology or ways of communication. But particularly in the current discourse, given the novelty of artificial intelligence, there's a tendency to overstate the novelty, and also to overstate the the changes it will bring. There is no question the changes are and will be very considerable. That is granted. But I think when we talk about education and what it takes to become a fully grown and well-rounded human being, the qualities that are required are fairly timeless. And I don't think that they are fundamentally affected by the computer science or artificial intelligence or the internet or any other particular form of technology. Specifically about artificial intelligence, this is something that it's a technology that now engages with the written, primarily written products of our culture and the cultural heritage we have. In order to make sense of what this technology presents us with, we as human beings, we need to have an understanding of what this heritage is. And also, this is particularly aimed at the next generation, you need to find a constructive way to dealing with the challenges that these technologies bring, not least in the way it will affect your professional prospects. And I think what the internet and particularly artificial intelligence now, which is based on prior communication innovations, has led to is a certain reduction in the importance of pure information. So rote learning, just the summarizing of facts, this is now something that technology can do much better than we human beings. And this will only increase. So young people, I think, and old people like us as well, we need to think, what is the value added that the human being can bring to the discourse, or more concretely to an employer? And I think, if anything, it increases the value of creative thinking, of critical thinking, of being able to create linkages between diverse areas of knowledge. And two very, very important areas of knowledge in order to understand culture, in order to understand our societies, and in order to understand how we have gotten where we are and where we will be going in the future, are history, of course, national history, but particularly global history and regional history. And a very big part of history is obviously law and government. And therefore, I believe that to be a modern person, to live in the current world and look into the future, we need to understand how we got here, and both the law and our history, and particularly the forms of government in which we are placed, have played a very large role. And this is not something a machine can take from us. This is an intellectual labor, and I deliberately call it labor because it is difficult and time-consuming, and it requires effort, diligence, and dare I say, love. These are things that a machine cannot replicate. But if we do it, we can then take the advantages that machines bring to us and actually build on the new opportunities that machines have brought us. So I don't think that to answer your question finally, that the new technologies have devalued these classical areas of knowledge. If anything, I think they have reinforced the need to engage with them critically, creatively, and I think with a certain affection. I think that's the right word. With a certain affection for the difficult but enriching material that we want to engage with. That's how I would answer your question.
I'm so happy that you use the word affection, because philosophy is the love of wisdom. It starts with love, the love of knowledge, the love of knowing, and the thrill that one feels when one has learned something new. I mean, that experience is just divine. Because you mentioned law, I'll come to my next question.
You're breaking off. I can't hear you.
That law can take a person anywhere. How fair is it to say that law can take a person anywhere?
You know, I don't really know how you mean this question, but if I focus it now on legal training, academic training in law, the adage you just mentioned is evidently true, because law is a highly valued and very general discipline. So having studied it, and particularly having mastered it and having done well in the educational institutions that teach it, allows one to embrace a very, very large variety of professional challenges and opportunities. And in that sense, I think this is one of the major advantages of a legal education compared to others. And unlike other very attractive university courses of study, like engineering, like medicine, like computer science that you've mentioned, is law also simultaneously an extremely valued introduction into the complexities of human life. And not just in the particular context in which one has learned it, but it allows you to both understand global context, but also, and I think this is underappreciated, because it gives us a certain form of thinking and a certain way of analyzing, and thereby a particular way of communicating that is transcultural, trans-regional. It allows you to become and enter a part of a very constructive global discourse. This is something that we, particularly engineering and computer science and medicine, have even more than us. But law is the one social science which requires the least and limits us the least in terms of cultural specificity. And I think this is the particular beauty and advantage of a young person studying law rather than another social science.
Thank you. How did you come up with a wonderful course like constitutional history that you taught? And where did the idea come from, and how did you develop it? Why did you do it in the first place?
You know, the initial decision was taken by my faculty here,
Yes.
and basically by the university, not just the faculty. And we entered this new field of online education. And the Faculty of Law was asked, as one of the faculties of the university, together with the other faculties, to offer one pilot course. And I had just recently joined the faculty, and I had a fairly international background. And then it was decided that someone with my background perhaps would be able to reach a more global audience than the purely Danish in which, or regionally Nordic, in which many of my colleagues work. And so I was tasked to do a course, and it was left to me what the course would be about. And I basically decided, and I offered my dean a choice, and I said I could do a course in international law, and I would do it well. But international law is a discipline that is taught at virtually all universities. So it would be a complement to an existing offering, and therefore not really fill a need that is there. Or I could alternatively offer a course in the Islamic world, which is not taught at very many universities. And there I think we would be able to fill a genuine niche, a lacuna in the offerings that might not exist at most other universities. And my dean agreed with me, and that's how we then embarked on a class on the Muslim world. And then I decided that one of the particular challenges of the Islamic world is that the modern states that have sprang up almost universally do not function very well. We have in the entire region, we have a certain challenge of coming to grips with modernity and the need for modern administrations, modern governance. So, and this is broadly the realm of constitutional law. And to the best of my knowledge then, and frankly still, there are no good overview courses or books on the public law tradition of the Muslim world. And constitutional law is an important part of public law, but obviously not the only one. We could do a similar course, for example, on administrative law, and in particular on tax law, which I would find very interesting, but that is something for the future, perhaps. But I think constitutional law is an extremely important but understudied and underappreciated part of the current challenges faced by contemporary Muslim societies. And in order to understand these challenges and the particular difficulties of governance in the contemporary Islamic tradition, I made a number of pedagogical choices. The first was that this should not be a specialist course aimed at Oriental studies or at Arabic studies or at Islamic studies. It should be open and understandable to anyone with an interest in the region. Secondly, it should, and this was something that for me was important, it should offer a genuine help to people in the region to understand their own political challenges better. So it's thought to present the political, but also the historical and sociological conditions in a way that would offer linkages, both within the region, but also between time and between issue areas, which therefore goes well beyond purely dogmatic law. Which I think this is important, because when you look at dogmatic law in this region, you will not really understand the challenges, because many of the constitutions are not really reflective of the political and social reality that they purport to regulate or describe. So my aim was to offer a realistic picture of public law in that part of the world. And whether I succeeded or not, I think you're a better judge than me.
You succeeded so much that I'm basically an economist and a moralist. So after I did the course, then I wanted to do an MPhil in morality as it can be applied to international relations. I could not find a professor, so I found one in Iran, and I did it from Iran. So your course was so successful, it inspired me to do something. And one thing that I discovered when I was doing my research was that President Wilson, who I always quote as Dr. Wilson, he would not have become a successful political leader had he not thought about reforming administration. And one person who became great because he studied constitutional law was Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. He was a constitutional lawyer. So just to touch upon that subject very briefly, how important do you think civil service reforms are in the Muslim countries?
You know, I'm obviously biased because I'm a specialist in administrative law and in administrative reform. I spent 10 years working on administrative reform, mainly in Afghanistan, but also in Iran, a little bit in Pakistan, and a little bit in Central Asia. So I am biased, but I would say that my views are not those of a specialist, but of actually a generalist who has studied the region. What I mean is that, particularly when we look at the wider Middle East, as I call it, the Islamic world from Morocco to Indonesia and Malaysia. Also, I'm aware Malaysia and Indonesia are special cases, and also Islamic Africa is a special case. But the entire Muslim world, the wider Muslim world, is driven apart by normative debates. And these are well known, and they're serious normative disagreements. So I'm not at all belittling them. These are, just to restate briefly, it's primarily the role of religion in public and private life. It's the question of equality, both between the sexes, but also equality between people of different religions and different ethnicities. It's the question of the proper scope of freedom and personal autonomy versus communal demands. It's the question of what is the proper role of political accountability. And that leads to the very important and very contested question of democracy. So these are value questions that are and continue to be very important, very undecided, and very brutally fought. So I'm not at all diminishing their importance. I acknowledge them fully and head on. However, even if acknowledging the importance of these normative questions, we need to take a step back, logically speaking, and look at the ability of public institutions, the state in its many forms, to actually carry out decisions, irrespective of what the decision is and how it came about. And that is ultimately the challenge of administration, as you put it. It's the ability of communities, of human beings in groups, to actually jointly do things. And here we have an extreme shortcoming in the Islamic world. Virtually all of them, all of these states, all of these political communities are not very good in carrying out the decisions that they have taken, whatever the decision is. And that has led to very inefficient administrations, very unequal administrations, and basically an undersupply of public services, but also public accountability and public order. And therefore, I think that these questions of administrative efficiency, administrative capability, and therefore ultimately of administrative law and administrative accountability are both logically prior and therefore more fundamental than these higher order value questions about equality, freedom, religion, etc. And that's also reflected in the course. There's a great emphasis on state capability below these normative questions.
That brings me to one thing which I have observed. When you look at the events of 1648, when the 30 Years' War was grinding to an end, that is when the European state system actually took off. And then there was this French Revolution, in which the state system got mixed up with brilliant ideas, and then we had the Age of Ideas. All right, yeah, as you said, some people were able to carry out their decisions, which became the Reign of Terror and stuff like that. For the Muslim world, we either used to live in big empires or in small cities. So in our case, the state just came about because the imperial powers just decided to withdraw. That's the way I'm looking at it right now. And then we had things like Arab socialism. All the isms got imposed one over the other, with the net effect that the people were not empowered at the end of the day. So first and foremost, is this analysis correct? And if it is correct, then how have things like Arab socialism and particularly, why do you think institutions have not become strong in Muslim countries and Muslim states? Thank you.
You know, Mr. Zaidi, you pointed out to the inordinate length of my course, which is some 50 hours of video lectures. So I'm not trying to now restate what I said in
All learn
these.
from you, sir.
Thank you.
All learn from you.
If I try to summarize the challenge, is that in the last, let's say, 400 or 500 years of Western European history, and it is Western European, it's not even Eastern European, it's a fairly limited geographical area which we're talking about. A number of political, social, but also intellectual, ideational events happened that had a disproportionately large impact on the wider world. Now we can resent this, and there's much talk about Eurocentrism as if this was a bad thing. I am an unapologetic a proponent of Eurocentrism. These are events that happened here, but they had an effect on the rest of the world. So if you want to understand the rest of the world, you need to go back to the source and understand what happened and why it happened. And you mentioned now two important events. The end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, which is exactly as you correctly pointed out, the foundational moment in which the modern state system came into existence. And we could speak for hours, actually days, about this event alone, but let me just point to two very important decisions and the reasons for them that were taken then and that continue to be important. One was, this is a peace treaty after 30 years of religious war. A religious war fought between now two different forms of Christianity, but no one should be under any illusions that this was exterminationist. Each side wanted to annihilate the other side. Each side was completely convinced that they were right and completely right, that there was no justice on the other side. What they realized after 30 years of trying to physically annihilate each other, and we have large parts of Europe that to this day are depopulated as a result of this war. It's hard to overstate the destruction of this war. What they came to realize is that it is not possible to physically annihilate ideas. So the peace that was created in 1648 is the acceptance that even if I hate you, and no one should be under any illusions that they continue to hate each other, even if I hate you, I need to live next to you. I need to find a way of coexisting with people that I don't like. This is the first important lesson of this event. The other, and that's a response to that problem, is that we have created modern states that basically treat each other as equals. And that then many modern ideas of territorial integrity, of internal autonomy, of basically what we describe today as sovereignty, were defined then. They didn't exist before. And the modern world is simply not understandable without the idea of a territorial, sovereign, independent, equal state. So if you want to understand the modern world, you need to understand the Westphalian Peace, even if you're not a Christian, not a European, or not even interested in history. The second event that you mentioned, the French Revolution in 1789, brought one new idea into the world, which has had devastating effect, both negative and positive. And this event, this idea simply did not exist prior, and that's the idea of nationalism. The idea that human beings should be politically organized on some idea of similarity. Now, Benedict Anderson calls nations invented communities, and there's much truth in it. But nationalism as an organizing basis for political communities stems from the French Revolution. And we cannot understand the modern world without the idea of nationalism. And out of this two political, social events, all modern political discourse has sprang. You mentioned the isms, all these political ideologies that are now based on the idea of a territorially based national political community. And what these political organizing ideas were, obviously were very diverse, but they all go back to these two events. And the problem in the Muslim world is that until 1797, that's now the third, 1798, that's the third date I would bring in. And that is the French occupation of Egypt, a few years after the French Revolution. Until that moment, the Islamic world lived in some form of splendid isolation. It basically continued the antique and then Islamic world that basically was relatively uninterrupted for almost 1,000 years. And suddenly, this part of the world that actually was functioning reasonably well, that was reasonably stable, reasonably tolerant, reasonably free, but it now realized that the world around it had changed. And these Frenchmen came into Egypt, and Egypt had nothing to put against them. And it led to a profound shock, and that shock is enduring to this day. Muslims woke up in 1798 to a world in which they were no longer the masters of their own fate. And they have grappled ever since with trying to reassert subjectivity, authorhood, the ability to decide for themselves their political, social, and ideational future. And that has led predictably to the importation of ideas, political ideas, but also economic ideas, social ideas from the world, the part of the world that was more advanced. And that was basically Western Europe. And you mentioned Arab socialism. We have pan-Arabism. We have pan-Islamism. We have fascism. We have nationalism. We have liberalism. All these are ideas that come from Europe. And you alert students would now pay attention, says, he mentioned Islamism as having come from Europe. What does he mean? Political Islam, as we describe it today, that has had such a devastating impact on your country in Pakistan, on my country in Iran, and everywhere else, is not a traditional movement. It's a reaction to these changes of modernity. And it's a political movement that is very diverse. They're not the same groups. They might actually be hostile to each other, but they have all imported elements of modern mobilization, modern political discourse, again, from that source. So they are part and parcel of this modern language of political action. And therefore, again, in order to understand it, we need to understand where these ideas came from.
Actually, my thesis is that the modern, let's not call it modern, but the contemporary extreme religious thinking in the Muslim world came very materially from Europe. It just did not come because of Europe. It's not Eurocentric. It actually came, in my research, I have mentioned names like Max von Oppenheim, who did work from the German side, and of course the very well-known the Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence. So, but that discussion for some other day. And as you mentioned, Eurocentrism, I am a person who believes strongly in an American centrism as well. I mean, after all, when we say motel, what is a motel? Motel is a creation of America, but motor and hotel combined, they created a culture of based on the automobile and stuff like that. But of course, because we are short on time, I will just follow up this question, and I will merge two questions together. What should Muslim countries do in concrete terms to come out of the mess that they are in? And where do you see the Palestinian issue going now after when things settle down?
To answer your first question, the first point of departure is an honest acknowledgement that there is, as you called it, a mess, that things are not good. That is the first point of departure. And we already at this level, this is not a foregone conclusion. There are vast numbers of Muslims, both in authority and not in authority, who claim that everything is good, that there's nothing wrong with our traditions. That is, I think, the first very serious reason why we are in the mess that we are, because we deny that there is a problem. There are any number of very serious challenges that we first need to acknowledge before we can reach even a discourse on how to solve them. We need to acknowledge that there are problems. And I give you now a random arbitrary list of very serious problems that exist and that remain unaddressed, also intellectually unaddressed. The first, perhaps the most important, is the role of women in our society. The way we treat women in Muslim societies is absolutely unacceptable. There's just no way around it. However you now rephrase Islamic tradition, the way we treat women socially, both in reality and in dogma, is unacceptable in the modern world. In a world where our women look at the rest of the world and see the opportunities that exist. I'm not saying everything is better somewhere else, but legalized and socially practiced inequality is unacceptable. That's perhaps the first thing that we need to acknowledge. How to resolve it and how it should look like is a different question. I don't purport to have answers, but we need to acknowledge that this is not acceptable. Linked but separate is the completely mainstreamed idea that human beings are unequal based on their ethnic or religious affiliation. This is one of the very serious problems in our society, where we have established expectations of ethnic superiority. I'm not talking to a Pakistani about Pakistani history, so let me talk about Iran. In Iran, there is a naturally assumed superiority of the original Persian speakers versus all the minorities. Now, the Islamic Republic actually has done better than previous governments, but it is still very clear that the minorities are not fully equal. It is both in Iran, but also in Pakistan and many other parts. There is a complete acceptance that, for example, refugees are not fully human beings. They're clearly not citizens. They're not political units.
The word naturalization is not familiar with, people are not familiar with the word naturalization.
Yes. So that the fact that we talk, like with the Afghan refugees, for example, that I know now, this is a situation I know very well. We're talking about 40 years of Afghan presence in Iran. So we now have the third or fourth generation of human beings who were born and raised in Iran, and we still treat them as aliens. This is not a way of running a modern society. The third acknowledged problem is and it's linked to this, what should be the role of different religious persuasions in the public life? We have in virtually all Islamic societies institutionalized discrimination, not only about non-Muslims, but also of Muslims of different, sects. I don't purport to know which of these sects has the better dogma. But I dare to say that a political community that openly discriminates against people based on the religious affiliation will not be fully stable. And this is something we first need to acknowledge and then find ways of resolving it. And virtually all Islamic societies suffer from that. The fourth, and then I leave it and come to your final question, we have not found ways of dealing with the resource challenge of our societies. Some of these societies have oil and other natural resources, but the exploitation of these resources does not happen in a sustainable manner or in a transparent manner. Actually, it has led to rentier states and actually fueled political and social dysfunction. Virtually all Muslim societies, apart from the Southeast Asian ones, have very serious water problems. They do not deal with the water constraints in a sustainable manner, unlike actually traditional Muslim societies. So here we have a situation where environmental protections, water resource management, economic development needs to become more sustainable. And I'm not now just using some buzzwords about climate change and environmental protection, but these are clearly now areas where our societies are not actively seeking solutions, basically because our governments continue to refuse that there is a problem. On this last point, to point to one area where we have seen sustained progress towards acknowledging and then finding solutions is the drug issue, where we see, for example, very different approaches in Iran and in Pakistan. Pakistan basically continues to refuse that there is a problem, whereas Iran about 15 years ago switched from that attitude and said, we need to acknowledge that there's a problem, let's find pragmatic solutions. And they've actually been quite good at it. So this is, for example, when students would ask, what would be an area where we've actually have seen progress? The drug policies and the public, particularly the government's way of dealing with the drug challenge, here actually we've seen sustained progress, particularly in Iran. On your final question about the Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian question, I link it to the Afghan problem. I think Muslims generally need to wake up to the reality of the world as it looks today. It is, in my view, unconscionable to speak about Palestinian refugees in the 5th generation. These people were displaced, but they were displaced 70 years ago. And we now have literally the 4th, 5th, sometimes 6th generation who are now born in majority Muslim societies, Arab societies, people who are ethnically and linguistically exactly like them, and they are treated like aliens. That is, with all due respect, not Israel's problem. That is an Arab problem. And it is a challenge that it's a deliberate policy implementation of a very inhuman and irresponsible policy. You know, I'm a German, as you know. Germany has experienced 25% of its population were displaced after World War II. Fully 25, a quarter of the population was expelled from the East and brought into West Germany. And they were integrated. And today, no one talks about the lost homes in Poland or in the Soviet Union. We now live at peace with our neighbors. And that is only possible because we have integrated these refugees and made them citizens. And this is easy, obviously, because they were German and spoke German and they're like us, but therefore it should also be easier for the Arabs, because these are Arabs, are Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs, and they're brothers and sisters. We should take the rhetoric at face value. And very significant blame needs to be laid at the hands of Egypt, at Jordan, at Syria, Lebanon, for having dealt with that issue in as irresponsible a manner as they have. This is basically what I would say on this topic, because the controversy is known. I don't think I would add anything new to the very serious problem that you've highlighted.
No, absolutely well said. And Germany, of course, was one country which, after the Second World War, was actually picked up and placed in a different place because they had to cut pieces of Germany and give them to Poland. And you were so kind when you said that, you say with all due respect. I mean, I don't say with due respect. I say it's an absolute shame that when we say Muslim societies, we forget that ours is the book which categorically says that when a refugee appears on your border, embrace him as your brother and God will take care of you. And after 75 years, in fact, I don't know, after 80 years, Lebanon and Jordan and Jordan is a case in point. I mean, I think 60% of Jordan is refugees, and they are still refugees. And when the 1948 crisis happened, in Lebanon, they said, don't let them move beyond Sidon. And then they carried out various massacres between 1976 and 1982. But again, I will say that now you have to go for a meeting. My very last question: if an older Ebrahim Afsa were to give an advice to an 18-year-old Ebrahim Afsa, what will that be?
Now you obviously open the Pandora's box. There's much I would tell my younger self. One of the things I probably would do differently is to treat time as a more valuable resource than I have. I thought, and I think this is a privilege of youth, that when you're 18, you think you have all the time in the world to learn, to do, to make. And I would, now looking back, now that time becomes a more restricted resource, I would probably be a little bit less generous with my time. I would be equally adventurous. I would be equally foolish in my intellectual pursuits and less driven by instrumental benefit. I think that is a good thing that I've done. But I would probably be a little bit more focused. And this was primarily the thing that I would do differently. I've spent many time in many different countries, and that's something that I found very valuable, and I would probably do even more of it than I have already done. So this is primarily the thing I would do differently. The other thing that is, I was fairly good at it, but this is something that I now realize is even more important than I thought it was then. And this is my advice to your listeners. And I know it's terrible to say it, but universities particularly, and education generally, happens in institutions, and they run according to norms and rules that are often unpleasant. And particularly, I was a rebellious youth. I chafed at them, and I spent a lot of energy fighting the rules. And ultimately, I've realized that the rules always win. So having a slightly more pragmatic approach to it, working with the system and still doing what you think is important, rather than foolhardily trying to change the rules. I think that's something that I would tell my younger self, to be a bit more pragmatic, less rebellious than I was when I was young. But I know that this is not advice that will be followed by your listeners.
No, the wise people always take advice from the more experienced people. That's what people should do at this age. Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Ebrahim Afsa, an accomplished teacher who has taught, I believe, if I'm right, he's taught in Germany, he has taught in Denmark, and he has taught in the United States of America, including universities like Harvard. I am proud to call him my teacher, and it was a real privilege, sir, to sit with you today, face to face, in a sense, and to learn so much from you and from your experiences. I wish we could go on more, but you are busy today. So inshallah, thank you very much. We will keep in touch, maybe in the future as well, if you have time. Always, it will be a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much indeed. Have a very nice day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eidi, for having me. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum.
Wassalam.